Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Making It Personal is provided by Sarah Vocations Ministry. Learn more at joinserra.org.
Making It Personal with Bishop William Joensen on Iowa Catholic Radio and iowacatholicradio.com.
Welcome to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. I'm Jeanne Thill, and on today's show, we're visiting with Dr. Dan Ebener. He's author, teacher, and speaker on developing leaders for churches and businesses and community organizations.
Wonderful. And here we are, mid-May. I hope people had wonderful Mother's Day celebrations. If you could or could not be with your mom in person, that you at least showed her a little love. And now the love of the Father for the Son radiates and explodes as we celebrate the Feast of the Ascension in our diocese. We know the Archdiocese of Omaha and the provinces of Nebraska as well celebrated on Thursday. But these sacred days. And, the 50 days after Easter, where did they go? I mean,
older we get.
The busy time and all those initiation sacraments and grandchildren receiving First Holy Communion and other things as well. And in this mystery, we put a temporal timeline to it, but is there really, did Jesus wait to go to the Father? Did he, obviously he spent time with the apostles, his time with his mother Mary and all that. But, he knows it's out of love for us that he goes to be with the Father. He appears most as himself as he's clothed in glory as well. And so we continue, and when the Father and the Son are together, the Spirit just radiates from them, and we'll be allowing those rays of the Spirit to come to the young people at St. Joseph Parish in Des Moines today, and All Saints Parish in Des Moines as well. And then we'll be heading on to other places, the Ascension Feast that we're celebrating, and the commemoration of the death of Father Jim Kiernan at St. Ambrose Cathedral. 10 years already, Jean, and someone that you must have known to a certain degree. I had brief encounters with him through the mediation of my uncle, a classmate of his, ordination classmate.
Well, he always came down to St. Thomas in Indianola because he was good friends with Father Frank Palmer. So he was always helping with reconciliations, and the two of them, their friendship was wonderful.
Yeah, so I'm going to meet, I met with his nephew Peter just to garner a few more part of the oral tradition and anticipate this Mass. So come join us if you will, and had a relationship with Father Kiernan tomorrow at 11 a.m. Mass at St. Ambrose Cathedral. We'll look to be at the Dowling Catholic High School Baccalaureate Mass at St. Francis of Assisi on Thursday night, and then on Friday the 22nd, commencement for Dowling Catholic High School. So I was just encountering a recent grad of Dowling, now it's studying at Clemson University. She looked at me and said, "Don't I know you from somewhere?" I said, "Maybe all school masses at Dowling." They're there. But pleased now to have Dr. Dan Ebener. We know good things were happening in the Diocese of Davenport and St. Ambrose University, where he's been a long member of the faculty, in addition to his other pursuits that he's there. St. Ambrose sponsored a fascinating symposium in April that unfortunately I was not able to be part of, but from A to Z, Ambrose to Gen Z, resourcing the tradition in response to contemporary concerns in the church. And the keynote speaker was Cardinal Timothy Radcliffe, O.P., Dominican, well-known from Blackfriars in Oxford, and the encounters with that, maybe crossing paths with him, and he was very pleased with his experience at St. Ambrose and the great hospitality shown him by President Amy Novak and her husband Kenneth as well. But Dr. Dan Ebener, thank you. We'll be very quickly calling you Dan because we accompany each other through the time of our strategic visioning process, which you guided us in 4 or 5 years ago now. It was a 2-year process, and then it continues to unfold. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Ebener.
Well, thank you, Bishop. It's always an honor to be in your company, and you're so articulate in the way you just went through that, that explanation of where we're at in the church year, and this time of Easter, where my mind goes right to, of course, the road to Emmaus, and how we always encounter Christ in profound ways when we just accompany each other on the road, and somehow Jesus is there in our midst.
Yeah, And that's what we felt. And, we had the steering committee composed of a diverse representation from the diocese. Some of those bonds and connections have continued and carried over into our diocesan pastoral council, even though we didn't want to become insular or cliquish. New members have joined us as well. But we look forward to hearing what your own life path has unfolded in those subsequent years, and just to kind of take the pulse of our respective dioceses and where things are in our larger church. So, Jeanne, back to you.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we will continue our conversation with Dr. Dan Ebener, author, teacher, speaker on developing leaders for churches, businesses, and community organizations. You're listening to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network. Welcome back to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. And on today's show, we're visiting with Dr. Dan Ebener, author and teacher and speaker on developing leaders for churches and businesses and community organizations.
And Dan, thank you again for being with us. And we want to kind of allude to your book, particularly on the leadership for the greater good and servant leadership and all that is embodied, not simply in a faith milieu, but with broader extensions of that as well. But we were kind of laughing at the break as you accompanied our group in the Diocese of Des Moines, Strategic Visioning, and you witnessed the trust that was established, I think, in relatively short order. And just as you would not put yourself forward as some guru with apodictic statements from on high that are not to be questioned, how did you see people relating to the bishop and each other in terms of the willingness to speak truth to each other?
Yeah, okay, I'm going to be honest here, because I've done strategic planning for like over 300 organizations over the last 40 years, and one of the things that I've noticed is that it's really important that the person in the highest position of authority is able to step back and listen to what the people have to say in such a way that they know that they've really been heard. One of the unfortunate things about charismatic leadership and charismatic offices like a bishop is that once the bishop has spoken, a lot of people shut down. They think, well, okay, that's the authoritative word. And so I've advised a number of bishops on this, as well as symphony directors and CEOs and mayors and other people in high positions of authority, that when we go through strategic planning, it's really important that they listen first. And I know, Bishop, we had this conversation when we were at the Divine Renovation Conference down in Dallas during our strategic planning session, because you were asking me on his bus ride that we were taking together whether you are to share your vision for the Diocese of Des Moines. And I told you, I said, Bishop, this is a really careful step that you need to make, because you don't want to come out too soon, because you're going to stop the conversation. But on the other hand, you are the bishop, and you need to articulate the vision for the diocese. And so when you do it, you need to articulate that vision in terms of what you've heard other people say. And you did that so well. You did that so well. In fact, we were laughing about the fact that, you have a staff, and this is, I think, really important for any person in high positions of authority. You have a staff that can tell you when you're wrong, or they can tell you when they disagree.
I'm laughing. I'm laughing now. I'm not always laughing.
Bishop, I've been meaning to tell you.
And that's really important, particularly because you're celibate. People like myself. I have a wife. I had a wife for 47 years who could tell me when I was full of myself, and I needed to have somebody, just bring me into that humble space. But you've got people around you, but that says a lot about you, that you're humble enough to admit your shortcomings, or just to be human, right? I mean, express yourself as a human being. That, that's what humility is to be humble, is to be human, to recognize that we all have our human strengths and our human weaknesses. And when the bishop can, articulate and demonstrate that humility, that goes a long way, and it helps you become more personable toward the people in the pews who might see you as just this stationary figure at the altar, but instead, no, you become a real live human being who can have that connection with your people. And that's so important, not just for bishops, but for pastors and deacons and all of us who, hope to provide leadership in the Catholic Church.
Well, and if that's there, that's a grace not only from my parents and family, but through the friendships and wise spiritual directors such as the late Monsignor Jim Barta and others who, inculcated that in me. And I think just, we were kind of laughing, as an academic philosopher, you're used to people disagreeing with you day in, day out. So even the students, when they realize they can do that, so that might actually earn them a better grade if they take exception to something that's there. Did you ever find in your experience of so many corporate, for-profit and non-profit leaders where that just became a kind of a deal breaker for you, that you just said, I just don't think this process is going anywhere because of a kind of intractable attitude by the leader?
Oh, absolutely. When I would first sit down with the CEO or executive director, whatever the title might be, I always would have this kind of conversation. I remember when I did strategic planning for the Archdiocese of Dubuque, probably this is 15 or 20 years ago, before they asked me to facilitate, they had already come up with their agenda, and the first thing on the agenda was the Archbishop was going to share his vision for the diocese. And I told the Archbishop, I said, look, if you want me to facilitate this, we need to put you at the end of the meeting and not at the beginning, because as I said earlier, once the Archbishop speaks, a lot of people are going to shut down. They're going to figure, half of the people are going to agree with you and figure, okay, I agree with him, so there's nothing to say. And the other half might disagree with you, that figure, he's already made up his mind, so I'm not going to say anything. And I've had bishops like yourself, and like it was Archbishop Jacobs at the time, and Bishop Cousins up in Crookston, Minnesota, where I did strategic planning there, who were very able, like you, to step back and listen carefully, do the one-on-ones with people, go to the margins, as Pope Francis said, because this listening can't just be to your inner circle. You can't just listen to your presbyteral council and figure, okay, I've listened to the people. No, you've got to go to the margins. You've got to go, as social network theory says, to the people with whom you have the weakest ties, the people who can provide some new insights, some fresh ideas, some strategic information that you're not going to get from your inner circle. So you did that, and I've seen other bishops and other CEOs do it. But it's a deal breaker for me at the beginning of the process. If that's not going to work, I can tell. Then it's not even worth doing the strategic planning if we're not going to listen first. But in your case, when we did the Diocese of Des Moines...
Enough about Joensen here. Okay, here we go.
But in the Diocese of Des Moines...
really. No, stop. No, really.
And the Academy Award goes too.
So the listening, and probably more than hundreds, thousands of hours that you offered us in the diocese, doing this with various focus groups, various constituencies, including those who really didn't see themselves affiliating with the church. So you're kind of a model of this, and a process that you call humble inquiry, which the world could do a lot better to have more of this, whether it's in the political realm or other ways. Could you describe that for our listeners?
Yeah, so humble inquiry is a one-on-one conversation where we ask questions for which we don't know the answers, and then we listen, and we listen carefully, and we summarize what the other person has said to the point where, first of all, they know that we heard them, and secondly, they can clarify if we got anything wrong. And part of the humble inquiry process is to make a human connection with that other person, and you begin to hear their story. Your job is to be non-judgmental, not to present your ideas. You don't ask questions like, well, have you thought about doing this, or have you thought about doing that? You're not making suggestions for how they can solve the issues they're presenting. Your job is to understand, to listen and to understand. When we do this, and these conversations can take, 8 or 10 minutes is the norm, it's a real gift to the other person, because in our society today, and you articulated this in your message in the Catholic Mirror this month, with artificial intelligence and social media and all the beeps on our phone and everything, we rarely get 8 or 10 minutes of someone's time where they give us their undivided attention and listen to our story, to our perspective. And when you're leading change in today's world where, the outside world is changing so rapidly that we have these adaptive challenges where we need to adapt to the ways in which the world is changing, there's no easy answers here. And so, being in leadership, you need to practice these humble conversations and talk to people closest to the problem, people who are in the pews. I'll give you an example. When I was doing these conversations at the Diocese of Des Moines a few years ago, I was doing a one-on-one with one of your staff, and he was telling me about one of his daughters who had left the church and had been very active in the church, but then she and her family left. And I got her contact information. I called her. I listened to her this was like about an hour and 15 minutes. We had a conversation about why she had left the church. And at the end of the conversation, Bishop, she said to me, Dan, if someone had had this conversation with me before I left, I would still be active in the Catholic Church today. A lot of times people just want to be listened to. They want to be heard. Mm-hmm. They want to be able to tell their stories. But in our busy world around us, we rarely take that time and give people our full, undivided attention and listen to their stories.
Mm. And as you say, that particular conversation ran well over an hour, and maybe there's fear for some people. If I kind of seed this determining role in how this conversation is going to play out, that's a vulnerability, and it's not just the person who's speaking who's becoming vulnerable, but the listener is becoming vulnerable at the same time. So
that's exactly the right word, Bishop, is vulnerable. So when you're in a high position of authority, especially, you need to be vulnerable and say things like, hey, I really need your help on this, or I really need to know what this looks like from your perspective, or, from your desk, what does this problem look like? It's like the story of the surgeon who's, cutting into the wrong knee, and everybody around him knows that he's cutting into the wrong knee, but everyone's afraid to say something because this person is not vulnerable, right? They're not open to suggestions from other people. So, vulnerability is exactly the right word. So leadership needs to express their vulnerability by saying things like, hey, I don't have all the answers. I need your insight. I need your fresh ideas. I need to know your perspective. How do you see this problem, and what do you see as possible solutions to it?
Amen. Amen. I'm struck that, part of the synod on synodality, and that's certainly received mixed acclaim and an assessment by different parties in the church and beyond. But the ingredient to it is something that I think is identical to what you're describing with humble inquiry, the conversations in the spirit, where, again, simply listening, not prejudging, not kind of orchestrating the path, and then relating back what one has heard so that, can bless that person, show that one has been understood, and that from that becomes new possibilities of connection and communion. Ultimately, our process in the diocese, sowing God's Spirit, cultivating connections in Christ through moments of encounter, friendship, and communion. I find those terms continuing to arise in the papacy of Pope Leo, and the spirituality of various figures like Monsignor Luigi Giussani, as we try to sponsor a moment here in all that we're about. Among the skill set that you kind of try to enhance or offer and kind of mentor people either through your writings, your speaking engagements, and other things, is emotional intelligence. And as a past formator, still very mindful of our seminarians, and fortunate to give the Day of Recollection a few weeks ago at the St. Paul Seminary in St. Paul, kind of, again, congruent with affective maturity. So emotional intelligence doesn't just kind of cash out as what one's IQ is.
Exactly. In fact, the research shows that EQ, which is the emotional quotient, the way we measure EI, which is emotional intelligence, EQ is a better predictor of workplace success than IQ. I mean, you need a certain level of IQ to get in the door. But what distinguishes people who are successful in a workplace, I think you could say the same thing in a family or a community of friends, is your emotional intelligence, not your cognitive intelligence. So, yeah, EI, it's the most popular topic I'm asked to speak about, Bishop. I'm doing a lot of presentations on EI. I go to Croatia in a couple of weeks, and they just asked me to do a workshop there on EI. It's a very profoundly important human capability, especially in this world of AI and social media. And as we become more distant with each other, emotional intelligence becomes even more important so that we can get back to those human connections, those social connections that, it really help us encounter God in our lives, right? I mean, you know this. This is how we encounter God, is through each other. And so, EI and humble inquiry, these ways that we stop and mindfully reflect on our relationships with each other, that's part of EI, is the self-awareness, and then the social awareness to be able to understand what other people's feelings are, what emotions they're going through, and not just the cognitive empathy that helps us, like read the news and I understand there's, a problem in Gaza, and so I cognitively can have empathy for what's going on in Gaza or Lebanon, but to move from there to, also the emotional empathy where I begin to identify with the emotions of another person.
This is such good stuff, Dan, and I hate to be not a gentleman here, but we're going to have to pause for the break, so let's good to leave our people at that, and we'll hear more.
Okay, sounds good.
When we come back, we will continue our conversation with Dr. Dan Ebener, author, teacher, and speaker on developing leaders for churches, businesses, and community organizations. To learn more about what Dan does, go online to danebener.com. That's Ebener. You're listening to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network. Welcome back to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen.
And before we go any further, always a shout out to the St. Sarah Club of Des Moines.
Yes.
The work that Jean, you and John are members of this, advancing, promoting, praying for, and helping to affirm those who already have vocations of priesthood and religious life, but calling forth others as well and supporting the church in the vital work to have workers in the vineyard. And the harvest is great, and more continue to come forth. The Sarans should feel very blessed that 6 men formally entering seminary and a second cohort of permanent diaconate candidates of 16 moving through the kind of scrutiny process that takes place. So with the 18 already well into their formation, so 2 cohorts on that. So,
but we are the second largest Sarah Club in the world.
Just saying. Wow.
Just saying. So, you got all these people praying for, vocations. So, not to take credit.
And in this month of May, we again mention to our listeners that pray that 6th decade of the Rosary, particularly for vocations to priesthood, religious life, and the diaconate. And I think those prayers are bearing great fruit. So, wonderful. We think about this with seminarians and others in formation, the emotional intelligence. Is that something, Dan, that are you kind of, you got what you've got, your family of origin, certainly a lot of formative things take place there, even without our being aware of it. Can one actually grow in emotional intelligence, or you can't just will yourself to that, right, by an act of intention?
I think it's the same question as, can we grow in discipleship? Can we grow in proximity to Christ? Can we grow in our relationship with God? So, if the goal is to try to lead and live like Jesus, and Jesus said, that he came to serve, not to be served, and that implies that, our leadership style should be that of servant leadership, where we put others first instead of our own needs and interests. We're constantly thinking about others and what their needs and interests are, and trying to serve, the greater mission of the church. If that's our approach, then emotional intelligence becomes really important, because emotional intelligence is what helps us to reflect on our own behavior and our own emotions, and to reflect on the emotions of other people. And we know that, we're emotional beings. We, as humans, we're emotional and social beings. And so our emotional and social intelligence becomes critically important, whether we're leading or just, we're practicing discipleship as followers of Christ. So, if we want to live and lead like Christ, I think EI and social intelligence, the social skills that it takes to relate to other people, identify with their pain, and be able to act on that. So, the third aspect of the third empathy is compassionate empathy. So after I identify with people's emotions and I know what they're going through, the question becomes, am I going to be able to do anything about that? So, the compassionate empathy is where we actually take action. We actually do something about our empathy, which is empathy would be a part of EI, emotional intelligence. That would be the social awareness piece, where we're, able to identify with other people's pain, but also then take that next step and do something, whether that's, attending a funeral of someone who's going through the loss of a loved one, or, whether that's actually, in our case, where we oftentimes feel helpless about, some of the great pains in the world like Gaza and Lebanon and Ukraine, where we know that we can support Catholic relief services and Catholic charities. And, we have ways as Catholics that we can, we can reach out with empathy and do something.
Beautiful. Dan, we'll probably have to bring this rich conversation to a close here. And, probably emotional intelligence not enhanced by having a conversation with an AI bot, probably. But
what? I was
maybe
thinking the same thing.
with the living God, Jesus, and as we approach Pentecost, with the Holy Spirit as well, asking for an increase of those gifts. So thank you for the many gifts that you have. I don't know if you'll be doing the Game of Thrones site visits in Croatia or not when you're over there. But,
but I'll definitely get to the coast. If you go to Croatia, you got to get to the coast, but you also have to get to Medjugorje.
That's right.
It's spectacular. Thank you, Dan Ebener. Thank you so much.
This has been another edition of Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. Thanks to our guest and all of our listeners throughout Iowa, Nebraska, all around the Midwest, wherever you may be listening to the Iowa Catholic Radio Network and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network.
You can hear Making It Personal with Bishop William Joensen every week on Iowa Catholic Radio and iowacatholicradio.com.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Making It Personal is provided by Sarah Vocations Ministry. Learn more at joinserra.org.